Imagine you're a Danish air traffic controller on a quiet Tuesday night, staring at the radar. Suddenly, a blip appears where it shouldn't be, crossing from the Kaliningrad exclave. It's a drone, and it's not squawking any identification. It's now in NATO airspace. But there's no panic, no frantic calls to Brussels or Washington. Instead, something almost automatic happens. A pre-written script kicks into gear. A French counter-drone unit stationed in Romania gets an alert. A Finnish-Swedish Arctic brigade, hundreds of miles away, receives a data packet updating their readiness status. A NATO OSCE plane, already circling over the Baltic, automatically adjusts its flight path to get a better look. This is the machine working as designed, a system built over 70 years, not for debate, but for speed. It's an architecture designed to be immune to paralysis or political hesitation. But then, just as a fighter jet is about to be scrambled for intercept, a message flashes on a secure terminal. It's a direct order from the U.S. Secretary of Defense's office, recalling hundreds of America's top generals and admirals from their European posts to an urgent meeting in Quantico. Suddenly, the machine hesitates. The generals who execute these standing orders are being physically pulled off the chessboard. And you're left wondering, why would a president try to stop a defense system that's working perfectly? The answer reveals a hidden logic behind NATO and alliance built not just to deter Moscow, but to protect the West from the slow poison of internal betrayal.
And that scenario, dramatic as it sounds, perfectly frames the core tension we really need to investigate in this deep dive. Our mission today is to pull back the curtain on the hidden logic that actually governs NATO's military response. It's a system that is fundamentally built for speed, designed, really, to eliminate debate when the bullets start flying.
So we're investigating how this Cold War-era architecture is simultaneously being tested on two fronts. Externally, you've got these new asymmetric threats like cheap, mass-produced drones flying in the gray zone.
Right.
And internally, by these profound political challenges and, well, loyalty traps aimed at slowing the alliance down.
We're going to try and distill the essential knowledge you need to understand this critical balance, or maybe imbalance, between democratic oversight, automatic military reaction, and the brutal economic realities of modern asymmetric warfare.
Yeah.
By the end of this, you'll hopefully understand why NATO moves when it does, and perhaps why certain political actors seem so determined to interfere with that movement.
And this is knowledge crucial for anyone following the future of European security, really. Okay, let's unpack this core idea first. The automaticity mechanism. I think most people, truly believe that every military action by NATO requires some fresh, televised debate in Brussels, followed by a vote.
Right, that's the common perception.
But the reality seems much faster, almost pre-programmed, inherited from the Cold War. Let's start with the historical root of this need for speed.
That's the absolutely crucial starting point. The entire architecture was shaped by the foundational fear of the mid-20th century, the risk of political paralysis, or worse, a decapitation strike by Moscow.
Decapitation meaning taking out the civilian leadership.
Exactly, wiping out civilian leaders or paralyzing communication networks. The fear was that if the alliance hesitated, even for a few hours while parliaments met or leaders consulted, well, Western Europe could face defeat before a formal political decision to fight was ever finalized.
Because the Soviets' advantage was always seen as speed and mass.
Precisely. So NATO's defense mechanism had to negate that time advantage. It had to be faster.
So the core trade-off they accepted back in the 50s and 60s was, we have to sacrifice some democratic oversight in the moment of crisis to ensure survival. The countermeasure wasn't better debate, it was better delegation.
Exactly right. The alliance implemented an architecture of automaticity. They realized they couldn't risk waiting for, 32 nations to reach consensus under fire?
Impossible.
So they pre-agreed military actions and delegation authorities decades in advance, deliberately bypassing the need for fresh political votes during a hot crisis. And this philosophy was actually inherited directly from the logic of nuclear deterrence.
The nuclear logic. We often think of nuclear deterrence as this separate, sealed-off thing, only unlocked by the president with the football. But you're saying the conventional defense strategy adopted that same speed over deliberation mindset.
In essence, yes. The thinking was similar.
This is where the political consequences start to bite, though. The system is maybe terrifyingly efficient, but it seems to remove political control at the crucial moment.
It does, by design. The nuclear system was set up so that launch plans were delegated and targeting was integrated, ensuring maximum responsiveness. That high-speed philosophy was extended and applied to conventional defense planning, too. Once the political trigger is pulled, and that might be something like an Article 4 consultation alarm initiated by a threatened ally.
Not even a full Article 5 attack yet.
Not necessarily. Once that alarm sounds, generals, specifically those dual-hatted commanders who serve both the U.S. and NATO, assume the responsibility for the operational sequence through standing orders. And this is key. The truly hard choices about what would happen and when were actually made in peacetime years ago by committees and planners.
So this means that if NATO is facing a fast conventional invasion, the response is more like an emergency reflex action, less like a calculated political decision in the moment.
That's a good analogy, a reflex.
But if the core fear was political paralysis, how did NATO ensure that the delegated power wouldn't be misused, by a single general acting too quickly, maybe leading to an accidental war?
Well, that's where the rigor of the doctrine comes in. That's the internal check, if you like. The authority is delegated, yes, but the actions are pre-scripted and integrated across the alliance.
It sort of reminds me of that fictionalized account you mentioned, the air traffic controller, Anders. His job was simply to execute protocols. He felt like a passenger in a system designed to remove the friction of human hesitation.
The efficiency is terrifying, but it is structured.
It is structured, and that structure is codified in the doctrine itself.
So to understand this terrifying efficiency, we have to look at the rule book that codifies it. The NATO Planning Doctrine, AJP-5. This is the document that really prioritizes speed over deliberation. Absolutely. AJP-5, the Allied Joint Doctrine for the Planning of Operations, dictates how NATO forces prepare. And the doctrine distinguishes between two major types of planning. This distinction is vital for understanding automaticity. First, you have crisis response planning, CRP.
Okay.
This handles emerging, unexpected crises dynamically. It's performed under severe time constraints when something unpredictable happens.
But that's not where the automaticity really lives, is it? The real engine is the other category, advanced planning.
Precisely. Advanced planning deals with identified potential threats to the alliance before they occur. This is where the long-term pre-agreed triggers and responses live. NATO doesn't wait for a crisis to define how it will defend key areas like, say, the Suwalki Gap or the Baltic airspace. Those plans are already sitting on the shelf, signed and ready.
Right. And within advanced planning, we find these core documents that dictate automatic movement, the standing defense plans and the graduated response plans. Let's start with the standing defense plans, the SDPs. What are they?
Okay, standing defense plans, or SDP. They're designed to address long-term, short, or even no-notice Article 5 security risks, meaning an actual armed attack on one or more allies. And critically, AJP-5 in Section 1 of 4 states unequivocally that an SDP is required to be immediately executable.
Immediately executable?
Yes, with execution authority delegated down to the appropriate command level.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If a specific threat is identified, like defending a specific border near Estonia against a specific type of attack, and a plan is written for it, the actual decision to go to execute that plan has essentially already been made by the system. And the command authority to press the launch button for that specific regional plan is already held by a regional commander, maybe even a 3-star general operating under SACSIR.
That's the entire point of delegation. The hard political choices were made in the past. The military commanders in the field are, in that scenario, simply the executors of political will that was codified years ago. Then the second crucial type of plan under advanced planning is the graduated response plan, GRP. Think of this as NATO's sort of tiered checklist for an existential crisis.
And the GRP is developed specifically for existential threats requiring the highest responsiveness. Which part of that plan is the immediate action trigger, the bit that really matters for speed?
Well, the GRP consists of 3 parts, but GRP Part 1 is the key here. This part provides comprehensive details on the integrated deployment and employment of high readiness forces. Think like the VJTF, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force.
The spearhead force.
Exactly. And AJP-5 specifies that GRP Part 1 is explicitly executable. It is the immediate action binder sitting on the commander's desk, detailing that initial mobilization sequence that has to be rapid and seamless.
That whole structural logic seems designed to produce plans and orders efficiently. It emphasizes the commander's intent, which gets refined over time, but the overall sequence is very logical, very analytical, aimed at ensuring timely action.
Yes, and this entire planning structure reinforces the core purpose we talked about, circumventing political slowness, or worse, political infighting during a crisis.
Or even betrayal.
And this brings us back to perhaps the most critical strategic function of the alliance, when you look at it this way, the anti-betrayal mechanism, The whole structure, the integration, ensures that even if a member's political leadership wavers or is perceived to be captured by an adversary's influence, the alliance is designed to continue to defend itself.
It's like an immune system.
It's the ultimate immune system, exactly, designed to repel internal political poisoning.
Which means the recent surge actions we saw, like Danish reservists activating, French counter-drone units moving into Romania, those AICS planes circling more intensely, these actions weren't the result of new last-minute political decisions made in some panic room.
No, they were the automatic execution of standing orders, triggered by Article 4 alarms sounded by frontline allies. It's important to clarify what an Article 4 alarm is.
Right. It's not Article 5.
It's not Article 5, which signifies an armed attack. Article 4 is a consultation request, triggered when an ally feels its security, territorial integrity, or political independence is threatened. But once that Article 4 switch is pulled by an ally, the system dictates that certain standing defense plans, those SDPs and GRP Part 1s we just discussed, must commence pre-agreed actions under the authority of generals operating under censure.
And this is where the recall of American generals to Quantico that we mentioned in the opening. This is where it intersects with the automaticity mechanism in such a profound, really dramatic way. The recall, framed publicly as, what was it, a discussion about warrior ethos?
Something like that, yes.
It looks like it's actually a high-stakes political countermeasure against NATO's automaticity.
It certainly appears that way. It looks like a deliberate effort to slow or obstruct NATO actions that are perceived by some political factions, perhaps, to threaten Kremlin interests. If a president feels they cannot directly veto the alliance's automatic escalatory ladder, well, the next move might be to physically remove the people legally bound to execute those plans.
Pull the generals off the board.
Exactly. It's a physical attempt to reassert political primacy and override the alliance's built-in anti-delay system.
So the political objective here is to create a crisis of command loyalty for U.S. officers. The dilemma for the officer corps must be profound. American officers serving under NATO hats are dual-hatted. They report up the NATO chain of command, ultimately to Saussure, but also up their national chain of command back to the Pentagon.
Correct.
They are legally bound under NATO agreements to carry out these standing defense plans, placing them in a position where they might have to uphold decades-old pre-agreed orders against potential internal betrayal originating from the highest civilian levels back home.
It forces them into an incredibly difficult position. A choice, potentially, between Article 5 standing orders integrated into NATO plans and the chain of command leading back to the Pentagon. The complexity is amplified because, legally, when serving under a NATO command structure, these officers are supposed to prioritize the alliance's mission as defined by those standing plans. So the recall essentially tests whether the institutional loyalty to the alliance's standing orders, the immune system we talked about, is stronger than the political pressure exerted by this loyalty trap back home.
It seems designed to induce the very paralysis the system was meant to prevent. But this time, the paralysis comes from within.
Precisely, from within one of its most powerful members.
Okay, so we have this decades-old betrayal-proof machine designed for speed and, frankly, large-scale conventional war. But now it's facing a completely modern and asymmetric threat, these cheap drones operating in the gray zone. This moves us to the second major tension point we identified, the operational headache caused by drone warfare.
Yeah, and the first thing to recognize is the consistent escalation we're seeing. We're seeing persistent drone and fighter incursions into the airspace of frontline states. Norway, Denmark, Romania, Estonia have all reported incidents. These provocations are definitely ratcheting up tension without crossing that formal threshold of Article 5.
And Russia is operating right in that gray zone. Let's define that a bit more. It's not just about physical incursions. It's an operational space designed to exploit ambiguity and, well, patience, isn't it?
Exactly. It's difficult to prove whether the airspace violations, whether they're by cheap commercial drones, maybe repurposed for surveillance, or by military aircraft flying aggressively near, say, a German frigate in the Baltic Sea. It's hard to prove if they are accidental or intentional. Moscow consistently denies what it calls an endless series of false accusations, yet these actions continually exploit Western patience and test alliance cohesion. They essentially force NATO to react constantly without being able to retaliate decisively.
And the fundamental risk here, as critics often point out, is that this persistent ambiguity increases the chance of miscalculation. Or maybe even a deliberate attack that could trigger a broader, unpredictable conflict. The system is designed for automaticity once the trigger is pulled, but the gray zone makes it really hard for political leadership to identify precisely where that trigger should be placed.
Hmm. And while these incursions pose an existential security risk over time, they are simultaneously creating an almost absurd economic problem for NATO. We're talking about the economic absurdity of interception, which might pose a far greater long-term threat to national treasuries than any immediate kinetic damage from these small drones.
This is the core asymmetry problem that NATO leaders like Secretary General Mark Rutte have publicly acknowledged, the sheer unsustainability of using high-cost defense solutions against these low-cost threats. It feels like a fundamental, almost existential challenge to the treasury of every NATO state.
Rutte confirmed this strategic dilemma quite directly. NATO forces simply cannot continue using multi-million-dollar interceptors against drones costing just a few $1,000s. It's just unsustainable in a long-term conflict of attrition.
And when you put actual numbers to that, the differential is just staggering. Let's just sit with these numbers for a second. We are talking about highly sophisticated surface-to-air missiles costing approximately, $500,000 to maybe $1 million per shot?
Sometimes more, depending on the system.
Being used to shoot down drones, like modified Iranian Shaheds, that costs as little as maybe $1,000 to $2,000 to manufacture.
That is precisely the point of these persistent, low-cost drone incursions. They are designed to exert psychological and economic pressure on NATO members, essentially draining resources one small cut at a time. It's not just a tactical issue on a battlefield, it's a war of attrition on the national treasury, fought far from any actual kinetic exchange sometimes. If you are forced to spend $1 million to maybe prevent $1,000 worth of damage, or even just to deal with a surveillance threat, well, your national budget will eventually feel the strain. You could bankrupt yourself defending against a cheap, abundant enemy.
That story you mentioned about the Romanian fisherman Marius living near the border really illustrates this disconnect, doesn't it? He watches his country fire what he calls diamond-encrusted buckets to stop a flood of simple, buzzing toys.
Yeah.
The expensive defense systems feel both comforting because they provide protection, but also deeply unsustainable, leaving him with, as he said, a knot in his stomach every night, knowing how much money is literally evaporating into the night sky.
And beyond the pure economics, NATO faces serious tactical and strategic hurdles, especially when these drones approach densely populated areas. Defending cities or critical infrastructure like major civilian airports or power grids from these small drones is far more complex than countering them on an open battlefield, like we see in Ukraine.
Why is that specifically harder? What are the main challenges?
Well, primarily because of the high risk of collateral damage. Counter-drone technologies that rely on conventional munitions, kinetic kill vehicles, or even fragments from proximity-fused missiles. They all have inherent risks when deployed over cities. Civilian safety demands high-level security precautions and very restricted rules of engagement, which severely complicates counter-drone effectiveness. You can't just, unleash the biggest, fastest missile you have in the airspace over Frankfurt or Copenhagen. The risk is too high.
And strategically, we also see this perception of maybe political schizophrenia. Analysts look at the overall military size of NATO. It's the largest and best-funded alliance in history. And yet, critics argue that the alliance is perceived as fearful, or at least hesitant, to respond decisively to these gray zone provocations, which the critics say only encourages further incursions along the border.
And this hesitation, while understandable perhaps from a desire to avoid uncontrolled escalation, feeds into the enemy narrative that NATO is unwilling to fight dirty, or maybe just unable to match the persistence of the threat. This is precisely the type of hybrid attack, combining military probes, information warfare, economic pressure, that is designed to test Western resolve. NATO knows it must adapt rapidly, though. They are aggressively learning from the ongoing conflicts, particularly Ukraine, and rapidly developing new, hopefully more affordable counter-drone technologies. Those are expected to be deployed, possibly in the coming weeks, to address the critical equipment shortage and replace the reliance on those incredibly expensive missiles.
But the alliance isn't just waiting for new tech to arrive. We saw earlier that the automaticity mechanism is already being executed in response to specific incursions, like those near Denmark recently. What specific, immediate steps has the military system taken?
That's correct. The system is responding based on existing plans. NATO has significantly enhanced its Baltic Guard mission. Now, that mission was originally launched primarily to protect critical seabed infrastructure, the pipelines and data cables, following some recent incidents and sabotage concerns.
Right.
But in response to specific drone and aircraft probes in the region, they've added significant assets to that mission. This includes deploying an anti-air frigate with advanced air defense capabilities specifically for that task, and also specialized intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, ISR platforms, drones, aircraft, maybe ships.
So they're using ISR to watch the infrastructure.
Exactly, specifically to patrol and protect those vital, vulnerable choke points and assets. The military response is integrated, protecting assets that the adversary seems to be targeting through these ambiguous gray zone tactics. It's essentially activating the pre-agreed defense protocols for that specific threat scenario. Okay. #Tech3, Russia's drone industrial base and implications for the eastern flank.
Okay, so the economic and tactical challenges of countering the drones are one half of the story. The other half is the source, the sheer scale and speed of the production facilities backing the threat. Let's delve into Russia's drone industrial base, because the quantity of what they seem to be producing has pretty grave implications for NATO's eastern flank.
Yes, the primary driving force here seems to be the de facto militarization of the Russian economy. Moscow has clearly recognized the crucial utility of drone warfare, both for surveillance and for delivering inexpensive strike capabilities, and is dramatically increasing indigenous production. Analysts see this as a natural evolution of its military-industrial complex, prioritizing volume, perhaps sometimes over cutting-edge technological sophistication in many areas.
And they are building serious, large-scale capacity, notably far away from the front lines, which suggests a commitment to a long-term conflict, not just a short-term surge.
Exactly. A very large-scale drone production facility has been opened in Yelabuga, in Tatarstan. Now, that's nearly 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This distance highlights two things. First, its relative protection from immediate Ukrainian attack, and second, the long-term, sustained commitment to building this industry. This facility is reportedly capable of producing thousands of drones every month.
Thousands a month.
That's the reported target. This is a true industrial scaling operation.
And what key models are coming out of this scaled production that NATO planners must be most concerned about right now?
Well, the factory is known to be mass-producing the Iranian-designed Shahed 136 drones, which Russia has renamed the Geran-2. These are essentially kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, designed for one-way precision strikes against static targets like infrastructure or command posts. The ability to churn out these systems in high volume is clearly a massive priority for Russia, both to meet its operational demands in Ukraine and to sustain the kind of gray zone pressure on NATO that we discussed earlier.
And this scaled production capability seems heavily reliant on foreign technology and components, which raises profound questions about sanctions evasion and the complicity, or at least the role, of Russia's partners.
Absolutely. The partnership with Iran is clearly deep and comprehensive. It goes beyond simple purchasing of finished drones. It involves exchanging technology and, crucially, establishing production facilities right on Russian soil, like the one in Yelabuga. That has substantially boosted Russia's domestic drone capability and reduced its reliance on finished imports from Iran over time. And critically, the sources detail a sophisticated covert payment network designed specifically to bypass Western sanctions and export controls that were intended to restrict these kinds of financial transfers and technology flows.
How does that network actually function? How are they managing to keep the money and the logistics flowing despite Western efforts to shut them down? It seems quite effective.
The network is complex, naturally, but it reportedly relies on two key strategies. First, the utilization of gold transfers. Gold is inherently difficult to trace through traditional banking systems, unlike electronic transfers, and it can be physically transported. This provides a relatively clean, anonymous method of paying for high-value technology and finished components.
Laundering through gold.
Essentially, yes. Second, they utilize a web of intermediary countries and shell corporations to facilitate the financing and logistics. This makes it incredibly difficult for Western allies to identify the ultimate end user and enforce existing export controls or freeze assets effectively. The movement of raw materials, components, and even intellectual property is carefully laundered through these third parties.
And beyond Iran, there's evidence of assistance and technological transfer coming from China that feeds directly into this industrial machine as well.
Yes, security sources indicate a deep technical nexus with China. Chinese drone experts reportedly visited a key Russian weapons manufacturer, IEMZ Kupol, to participate directly in military drone technology research and development.
So direct help improving the tech.
That suggests direct input into improving Russian designs and manufacturing processes. Furthermore, the Russian industry is also receiving large quantities of Chinese-made attack and reconnaissance drones. But these often come through Russian middlemen who facilitate the sale and import of systems explicitly meant for military use, possibly circumventing official Chinese export policies.
And it sounds like the supply chain runs really deep down to the consumer level, too, creating almost a whole-of-society effort to bypass these controls.
It does appear that way. Reports suggest that ordinary Russian citizens are actively involved, purchasing off-the-shelf components and equipment from China online. Things like basic camera systems, guidance stabilizers, small engines.
Stuff you could buy on Alibaba or similar sites.
Potentially, yes. Components that can be easily used to build domestic drones for surveillance or even small attack roles. These are then reportedly voluntarily provided to military entities or various organizations supporting the conflict effort. It's a kind of decentralized, crowdsourced model that ensures scale and makes large-scale export controls virtually ineffective against these smaller, fungible parts. It's hard to stop someone buying a camera.
So if Russia can rapidly scale up this inexpensive, technologically assisted drone production and bypass sanctions so effectively, what are the most immediate and frankly dire security implications for NATO's eastern flank, for countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland?
Well, the rapid advancement and sheer scale of this drone capability have significantly intensified geopolitical tensions. It makes the threat of conflict feel much more immediate and real right on NATO's frontier, particularly for the Baltic states. They are now facing a potential force multiplier designed for mass attrition warfare that was previously unimaginable just a few years ago.
And we are seeing some alarming reports that suggest Russia is preparing for extreme speed if conflict were to erupt on that frontier, not just relying on drones, but integrating them.
Indeed. Some analysts warn that Russia's evolving strategy aims to potentially expand the European conflict, with forces reportedly positioning near the Estonian and Lithuanian borders, specifically configured to achieve a very rapid operational tempo. These forces, potentially supported by mass drone attacks to suppress defenses or disrupt command and control, could potentially occupy those countries in a very rapid time frame.
Yeah.
Some reports controversially suggest requiring only maybe 45 days.
45 days.
That's the alarming assessment from some quarters. The idea is to achieve objectives before NATO could fully mobilize and deploy its larger, heavy reinforcement forces across the Atlantic and from Western Europe. It's about creating a fait accompli.
That terrifying potential speed makes the current hybrid attacks, this blend of military probes, information warfare, economic pressure, it makes them a decisive test for the alliance's relevance and readiness, doesn't it?
It absolutely is the test. It tests whether NATO, Europe, and the U.S. can adapt their readiness postures, their decision-making cycles, and their political systems to counter this new compressed speed of warfare. This is the daily reality for citizens on the front line, like that history teacher you mentioned, Elena, in Narva, Estonia, living right on the border with Russia. She feels the threat of these mass-produced humming machines, not as some abstract geopolitical chess game, but as an intensely personal, immediate fear right there on the border. Knowing that NATO's automaticity, the system we discussed, must fire perfectly and immediately to meet that potential 45-day window.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Incredibly high. Good. So, just to synthesize what we've discussed here, NATO's entire military structure, built painstakingly over 70 years, fundamentally relies on this institutional automaticity. It's like a self-correcting immune system designed to resist internal political paralysis and ensure the rapid pre-agreed execution of defense plans, those SDPs and GRP Part 1s. But that very automaticity is now being actively tested by internal political maneuvering. The calculated recall of hundreds of American generals, for instance, seems intended to induce a crisis of command loyalty, precisely where the automatic trigger lies.
Right. And simultaneously, that same system, which is built primarily to fight a large-scale conventional war against a more symmetrical threat, is grappling with this completely different, external, economically debilitating problem of gray zone warfare. Waged by cheap, mass-produced drones that are supplied through complex international evasion networks, using methods like covert gold transfers to bypass sanctions. So the automatic plans might be firing according to the doctrine, but the human executors are being called into loyalty traps. All while the nature of the threat itself demands an agility and especially an economic solution that the current high-cost defense paradigm just cannot sustain long-term.
It means the survival, or at least the continued effectiveness of the alliance, therefore, depends less on writing entirely new, grand strategic plans, and perhaps more on the integrity of its decades-old immune system, the chain of command, the adherence to standing orders, and the unhesitating execution of the plans we analyzed.
So the profound tension revealed by this deep dive is that the alliance's structure, which was cleverly designed, really, to repel both external aggression and internal political compromise, is now being tested simultaneously by both threats at the same time. The alliance's success seems to hinge on whether that deep institutional commitment to pre-agreed defense protocols can withstand the intense political pressure aimed at slowing it down, and whether military innovation can somehow outpace the economic attrition being caused by these mass-produced, maybe $1,000 threats.